Okay. Okay. Well, I think we have a quorum of everyone here. Let me, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's close. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
For city folk.
5. We have 8. I think that's enough to move forward. Is that? Yeah. Let's do that. Okay, so we'll call to order right at 10 a.m. And first off, I'd like to recognize that we're conducting our business today on the territories of mostly the New Channels people. Oh, welcome, Ron. And also perhaps others in the Coast Salish territories. Most notably in the Alberni Valley, the Hupatchisitt, the Shot First Nations, where the ACRD main office building is located. I would also note that this committee of the whole meeting is being broadcast live on YouTube and through our website. And so you'll be able to get to it there or that sort of thing. However, when we get to question period, or if there's any questions or comments to be had, they're mostly to be done not through the comment function within Zoom or YouTube, but rather to an email that is responses@acrd.bc.ca. And we'll check at the end of our meetings for any questions to be asked and potentially answered at the same time. But sometimes we have to come back and answer them at the next meeting. Okay, so we have an agenda before us, and I'm not certain that there's anything to add to the agenda beyond materials. Is that correct, Wendy?
Mr. Chair, there are 2 late items for consideration by the committee of the whole, and it's correspondence under section 4A. Nikki Lavasser, opposition to the ban on wolf hunting, and Val Geist on a similar topic, same topic.
Okay, so those are pieces of material to be added, correct?
Correct, yeah, and they were emailed to directors earlier today and also uploaded to the website and are submitted for consideration as a late item.
Okay, thank you. So that would be the full entire agenda as presented. It would be as amended.
Correct.
Okay. Would anyone like to add anything to the agenda or take it off or just move it? Director Roberts, you move. Okay. And Director McNabb, second. Okay. Any further comments? Whew, everyone's turning their cameras on and off and it's shifting my view. Okay. All those in favor? All opposed? Okay. Motion carried. Okay. That brings us into presentations. So first off, I would like to welcome Ms. Christina Benti, Strategic Leadership Solutions. She's here to talk about asset management, and that's always welcome. So thank you, and please take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today and allowing me to speak to you. For those of you who don't know me, as indicated, my name is Christina Benti, and I work with Asset Management BC, doing these asset management, they're kind of 101 presentations. So the thing about my presentation today is I'm actually not going to tell you anything that you probably don't know. However, my intention is to deepen your understanding of asset management and to get into answering some questions about how to deepen your practice when it comes to asset management. So a little bit about me. I am a speaker. I am a researcher. I've been researching asset management. I've been researching the neuroscience connected to decision making and in relationship to, particularly for elected officials. I'm also a performance coach for governing bodies and a former politician myself. I did 12 years as an elected official, a couple terms on council and a couple terms as mayor, and 1 term on the regional district for the Columbia-Shuswap regional district. So, and before COVID, I was traveling across the country doing asset management awareness building workshops, and being a real advocate for leadership in asset management, particularly for elected officials and senior management. And I was up in the Northwest Territory speaking at a conference up there, up in Inuvik, and somebody came up to me and they said, well, you're kind of a big deal in the asset management world. And I said, well, thank you. And I laughed. And I said, you know, I feel a little bit like a big fish in a mud puddle, because actually nobody, it's hard to get people to care about asset management. The word's off-putting sometimes. And so part of my job and my passion is to get people to care, to get elected officials to care, to get citizens to care, and because it's actually a co-created reality. The challenges that we're facing with our infrastructure and our services around service sustainability is actually a co-created reality. So we have to bring those solutions together. There has to be a collective approach to that. So my presentation today is there's an intention behind it from FCM. It's funded by FCM and through Asset Management BC. And I will apologize at the outset because I think like a scientist and I talk like a preacher. So you'll have to bear with me. So I want to first start off by telling you, before I get into the presentation, what asset management means to me. And being a former politician and now working with governing bodies, asset management for me means choosing excellence over mediocrity when it comes to governance and stewardship of publicly owned assets. It means telling the truth about the true cost to provide services to the public and the risk to future generations if that long-term vision is not held. It's also about choosing rational, evidence-based decisions. It's about making those decisions as opposed to emotional decisions. It's about choosing to be brave over being popular, and it's choosing to communicate both the challenges that you've inherited and the opportunities that you face. Asset management, I think, again, is also about choosing to filter every decision through the lens of what your community wants, and coupled with what are they willing and able to pay for. And it's about choosing reality over fantasy. So even though I have this presentation that I'm going to give you now that's from FCM and Asset Management BC, that's actually what I want you to take away. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, that's what I want you to take away. That it's about choosing governance excellence. So I am going to share my screen now, and I want to add also that if you have questions, and like I said, I can talk like a preacher, and some of you have heard me talk for 6 hours about asset management. I know that. So if you've got questions, please interrupt me, raise your hand, but somebody interrupt me and I'm happy to answer questions. Otherwise, I am in danger of talking and talking and talking. So
and in this instance, if it is just for clarity and that sort of thing, feel free to just interrupt yourselves instead of going through me, and it'll just break the flow. So yeah, please go ahead.
Super, thank you. All right, so I'm just going to bring up the PowerPoint slide now. All right, everybody's good. You can see the slide. Thumbs up. Awesome. All right. So like I indicated, that this is part of a UBCM initiative that was to develop some asset management awareness building and communication tools and awareness across the province. And this was actually based on a UBCM resolution from the 2018 UBCM conference. So I am going to get into a little bit of again, a lot of things that you know already And I'm gonna move through those relatively quickly, because and hopefully like dispel some of the myths around asset management. Because I think one of the challenges around asset management is the word itself. For one thing, oftentimes for elected officials, the word management right away, boards and councils are like, well, that's staff's job, right? Because it has the word management in it. And as you know, it's staff's job to manage the day-to-day operations. But elected officials have a huge responsibility when it comes to providing setting the levels of service, the strategic direction, determining what services you're going to provide, what level you're going to provide them at, what are the resources required to provide those. So elected officials have that overarching stewardship that is really connected to asset management. So I think it's important to actually address what asset management also is not. And asset management is not, it's not a plan or software or data collection. So, oftentimes I will hear elected officials say, well, we've got an asset management plan, so we're doing asset management. And one of the things I will say back is that, well, if I gave you a running plan, does that make you a runner? And it doesn't, right? Unless you actually put your running shoes on and run, you're not a runner. So asset management is actually a philosophical lens through which you are making your decisions. And it should be at the forefront of all of those decisions. It's also not software. Again, I often hear from elected officials, oh yeah, we bought some great software and now we're good. And yeah, software is great, but it's kind of like exercise equipment. If you're not, it doesn't actually matter what software you use. It's whether you're using it and whether you're using it appropriately to actually make a difference in your life. So it's an ingredient. It's one of the ingredients, but it's not asset management. It's also not. It's not data collection. It's really easy to get buried in all the data and in the information. And one of the things I often tell staff is, don't get buried into the data. Use your data to tell the story and paint a picture of where you're at. Perfection is often the enemy of execution, right? So having perfect data is not the best way to go. Use the data that you currently have, continue to develop it, identify where the gaps are in your data, where you need more information. But use your data to paint that picture of where it is that you are and where you're actually going along the maturity continuum. And of course, it's also not just the job of staff and consultants. Staff's job is fearless advice, right? Their job is to give you fearless advice and then loyal implementation. So in terms of services and service levels, particularly around non-technical and non-legislative levels of service, council and boards have and elected officials determine what are the resources that we are going to put towards our services. What are our cost recovery targets? Where are we going to focus on? Are we going to focus on recovering our costs for services, or are we going to focus on the public benefit? So some of those philosophical decision-making around asset management is definitely the role of elected officials. And of course, your consultants work with your staff, but never think that it's just the job of a consultant to come in and do an assessment of your assets and services and then give you a report. By nature, engineers are very risk averse, and so the information, you get to decide, you get to customize that information based on usage, based on the services that you provide, and it's important that you make sure that it's relevant to each of your services in the communities that you provide. And that's on the ground information that all of your all of your staff will have. They'll know. They're the ones that deal with the assets and the services. So it's that integrative approach that's really key. It really is actually about all hands on deck, right? It's understanding that it's integrative. It's integrative for elected officials. It's integrated with the staff, but it's also those who deal with the staff, or sorry, those who deal with the assets and the services, those who deliver them, those who maintain them, but it's also even the frontline staff. So, you know, the ones that are, say, receiving the payments for the service, they should actually have a good fulsome understanding of asset management, because they're the ones that are actually going to deal sometimes with the public questions or the public, you know, concerns around changes to fees. And if there's a rationale understood by everyone in the organization where the overarching direction is, then it helps everybody to kind of be on the same page. But here's the thing about an integrative approach is that it's also it's your community as well. They are not just a bystander, right? They use the service. They're the reason that you provide services. So they need to understand, again, the link between the level of service in particular and the cost to provide that service. So when I say the word asset management, it's really about thinking about that integrative approach. And I would dare say that there's nothing on your agenda that does not link back to asset management, because it'll link back to the services that you provide. There's nothing, everything can be linked back to asset management. So the reality is that asset management is that it's a decision-making tool within your organization that allows you to provide safe, sustainable, predictable services, right? In a consistent, financially responsible manner. The public doesn't actually they just want to receive services. They want to show up at the recreation facility and have it open at the hours that it says it's open, or the landfill. They want clean, clear, safe drinking water every time they turn on their tap. They want to be able to flush their toilet and have it disappear. They don't want to wonder if that's going to happen. And so the systematizing asset management within your organization allows you to move towards being more sustainable in the long term. And that's the destination for your community. And the reality is we've overbuilt our environment and we have underinvested. And so we actually have to be deliberate about turning the tide in terms of how we're going to make sure that 7 generations from now, they're not going, hey, what kind of decisions were made in the past? But they're going to, one of my favorite reminders, particularly with asset management, is like, it's about being a good ancestor, and it's about making good decisions so that you are benefiting future generations. So here's when things can go wrong sometimes, and believe it or not, this is actually this is a picture from a community. It's from 2018, actually. So a modern municipality built a bridge that actually collapsed only a couple hours after the ribbon cutting. And it's an example of the importance of having an asset management plan that incorporates a risk management plan when it comes to new infrastructure. And you'd sort of think, well, how could this happen from infrastructure that was built in 2018? Well, apparently the municipality decided to save money, and they didn't do a geotechnical report. And as a result, that the bridge collapsed. Now, luckily, nobody was hurt, but had they had an asset management plan that took risk management into consideration, then this bridge wouldn't have been built in the way it was. Here's an example, also an example of underinvesting in deferred maintenance. This was from existing infrastructure. And of course, there's no ribbon cutting for existing infrastructure, right? But it is an I told you so moment in Montreal. And it was 2013, August of 2013 in Montreal. And obviously there's a backhoe in a giant sinkhole. And the machine operator was sent to the hospital, but so someone was actually hurt. Luckily, nobody else was hurt, but it was due to aging water pipes that had been leaking for a long time, and the business owners had actually been complaining about it, but nothing was done. The Auditor General had in Quebec described the fact that there had been years of neglect and deferred maintenance that caused minor problems. So minor problems that eventually added up to a major problem, and now you've got this sinkhole. The interesting thing, and this is what's really important to take away, is that the city was spending $8 million on maintenance of their linear assets and their road. So they were spending $8 million a year. They were supposed to be spending $200 million a year. And again, those are some pretty big numbers, but it's all scalable. And if you think about your own assets, one of the questions that you should be engaging in staff in, how much should we be spending in maintenance? And how much are we actually spending? And as that gap grows every year, what is the consequence? And that's a philosophical risk management conversation that happens at the elected officials table. And staff's job, again, is just fearless advice and then loyal implementation. So it ended up costing them. So now they had to bring everything up to where it should have been. They end up having to spend $600 million a year to bring everything up. So that it ended up costing them so much more than if they would have just done the routine maintenance and had been proactive rather than reactive. So it's an important lesson not to be lost, and it could have been even more disastrous. So here, the question around why asset management, and the reality is, if you build it, you better plan to maintain it, renew it, or replace it. But here's the thing that's important to remember, is that when you're replacing assets that provide services, you don't actually have to provide like for like. So part of your conversation when you're looking to renew an asset is questions around, why do we provide this service in the first place, and is this the asset that can deliver the service? So you can, and we'll get into this in a little bit when we talk about service levels of service, but you may have to decide if you're going to right size your service. So I just want to pause here for a second and ask if there's any questions or thoughts so far. All right, hearing none, I will keep going, and then I will ask you a question at the end. So the reality is that your organization has been, whether it's the beginning of the Roman aqueducts to now, your organization has been managing assets all along. So this is nothing new, but asset management as a process is just putting some rigor and structure around that process. So, and what the process allows us to do is understand what the cost of reactive and short-term thinking has cost us I know for me, when I was an elected official, most of our focus was on the capital costs of building new assets and providing new services. And we failed to take the full operational and maintenance costs and replacement costs into consideration. And so when we focus just on those capital costs and we fail to take into consideration what the additional costs are going to be, the capital costs are only like 20%. I was listening to somebody tell a story about Warren Buffett. It reminded me of asset management because one of my superpowers is that I can turn any conversation to one about asset management. He was talking to a bunch of students about their physical and well-being. And he said to them, what if I gave you all a car today? How would you feel? And of course, everybody was super excited. And he said, what if I told you that car had to last 10 years? How would you treat it? And then he said, what if I told you that you actually had to make that car last your entire life? Well, you'd look after it very differently. And he was trying to make the analogy behind our physical health, and that we only have one asset that we have to look after, our brain health, our physical health, mental, emotional, spiritual. But it's important actually to translate that onto our assets, that what is it going to take to extend the life of the asset so that we're maximizing it, so that the public gets the best out of it. And I think the numbers are that, you know, every dollar that you spend on preventative, proactive maintenance can save you $6 to $10 on reactive recovery. Now, I don't even want to call it maintenance, but so it can cost you. So there is a financial argument for taking to having that big picture thinking around your assets and your services. So it's important to recognize that that you're actually required, in order to access gas tax funding, you are required to show some type of progress on your asset management plan. There are a number of local governments that are quite far behind. My understanding is that you guys are really moving forward on the maturity continuum, and that's fantastic news. That bodes well for you and your organization, for your staff, and for this board. So, but it's important to understand that it needs to really be identified as a priority. Asset Management BC has plenty of resources, including the climate change and adaptation for asset management. That document introduces how you can adapt asset management or climate change adaptation into your asset management planning. The nice thing about the Asset Management BC wheel is it demonstrates the iterative process of asset management, that it's a non-linear process, that it's iterative. There's no destination. You're always on a journey, and it's about getting better and doing better rather than arriving at a journey. So it's an iterative, integrative process, and there's no the end goal is sustainable service delivery, but nobody is replacing their assets at the rate that they're wearing out. So it's how can we move towards that destination? That's the goal, really. So a little bit about asset management in action. It looks different to different people. And as an elected official, it really means understanding what are the services that you provide to your community. And every community is different in terms of what those services are. The first component of asset management is knowing your physical assets. What are those facilities what are the facilities and the buildings and the parks and the trails and the garbage cans, the landfill, all of the different components of the services that you provide? Those are your physical assets. 60% of Canada's publicly owned infrastructure is owned by local governments. And that amounts to, I think it's $80,000 a year of investment in per household across the country that we've got invested into publicly owned assets. But having a good understanding of what are your services, what are the services that you provide that contribute to quality of life for your residents. And also it means taking into consideration what are the natural assets that you have in your area that also provide a service to. We can't afford to overlook them. So, and natural assets are, they're cost effective actually and resilient, and they often require much less maintenance than engineered assets, and they are more adaptable to climate change. So it's important to take them into consideration and acknowledge their presence in your community. The types of services that natural assets can provide include things like erosion control, air purification, and of course, drinking water, your aquifers, so protecting those. As many of you know, the Public Sector Accounting Board has been taking into consideration, looking at ways to include natural assets into their accounting practices. And natural assets are, including natural assets in your asset management plan is there's a lot of granting opportunities right now to take advantage of. There's lots of provincial and federal funding that's available to do that. So check out I think it's the Municipal Natural Asset Organization. And see, of course, I'm sure you've heard what Gibson's has done with their natural capital assets. So recognizing that's part of your asset management plan. The other part of your asset management plan is your people, right? All the people that deliver services. So that includes obviously your employees and your contractors and volunteers, and it also includes your residents and yourself as a elected body. The ones that are dealing with the asset every day have extensive knowledge on the state of the asset. And so part of your role as an elected official is to make sure that you're investing in, that you're providing the resources to help them invest in developing their internal capacity when it comes to asset management. And sometimes the process reveals that you don't actually have enough people delivering the services. And with fewer people, it means that your service levels are actually going down. They're going down over time. So it's part of the asset management is recognizing your human assets. So some of the basic questions around asset management really start with identifying your services. What are the services you provide and why? I was talking to somebody yesterday from a local government, and we were having a conversation about asset management. And they were talking about the fact that they do roadside mowing, and the public works manager said, why do we do roadside mowing? And everybody had a different answer. And he said, what it highlighted is that nobody actually had talked about why they provide this service. It was something they'd just always done and hadn't really thought about. So one of your first questions is not, where's the asset? What do we own? It's actually, what's the service we provide and why do we actually provide it? I worked with a community up in the Yukon that had a helicopter and a helicopter pad, but they didn't have anybody to fly the helicopter. They didn't have a helicopter engineer. So they had an asset that actually didn't provide any service to their community. So your first question is, what services do we provide and why do we actually provide that service? It should be part of the orientation process right after an election, is getting clarity on the what and the why. Of course, the second part of that is identifying the assets that provide the service and what's the function that they provide. And then describing what's the level of service and the performance measures. So what's the level of service, the current level and the desired level, that's, what's legislated. So you don't get any say in the legislated services, but you do get plenty of say in terms of what services that you provide and at what level on the non-technical, non-legislated services. So those services are determined by the board. They're not determined by staff. And sometimes by habit, that hasn't always been the case. So making sure that you have some clear definitions around what your customer service levels are, and developing then strategies to ensure that you're providing the service level now and into the future at the same level. And that's a discussion that the board actually gets to have. So I know that staff shared some of their customer level of service objectives for water and the landfill. So thank you for that. So I know that you're working on that, and it's really helpful for you to be able to define those customer levels of service. So then you want to identify what are the performance gaps. In other words, what's the asset's remaining life, and what assets are most critical, and what's the level of risk? What's the risk to their function and sustainability? And then develop strategies to address the gap and a service delivery plan. And then here's the kicker: develop that service delivery plan and then stay the course. Oftentimes it's easy to get distracted from the course that you've set, but part of your job is actually holding the rudder and keeping the ship going in the right direction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about establishing customer non-technical levels of service, but I would just want to check in again. You guys are on my other screen. Everybody's good. You're all checking your phones. I know. I told you I'm talking like a preacher. Yes. There's one question. Please, please go ahead.
So the one thing I was looking at, I mean, I've been in asset management all my working life. I've been an auto dealer for 40 years. So one thing I was looking at on the previous chart there you had was the replacement versus the maintenance, and they both kind of affect each other. The calculation is affected by each other, and I'm wondering where that rationale, like where you find sound rationale for the maintenance factor. You know you're going to have to replace it, and it's just a matter of when. And so you need to, whatever maintenance you do, you know you're going to end up having a replacement. It's just exactly like a car. You know, so is there some kind of science that's applied to that percentage, or what?
So yeah, that's a really good question. So it's the art and the science of that calculation, because it depends on a number of complex factors, and it's about building a business case to demonstrate that proactive maintenance versus reactive maintenance is actually going to extend the life of the infrastructure, and then you'll be replacing it. You can put off replacing it till a later date. In terms of the science, I can't actually answer the question, but I know that there are formulas out there that there's plenty of ways to do that. So what the other thing, like I said, that needs to be taken into consideration when you're replacing an asset is, do you need to replace like for like? Do you need to replace the exact same asset for the service? Could there be changes to level of service, even minimal changes to levels of service, that actually could be achieved with a lower cost? Also supporting it within your organization, supporting some creative solutions with staff. There's all sorts of work being done right now in extending the life of an asset. 10 years ago, you would have had to replace underground pipes, and now there's ways to extend the life just using different technology. So ensuring that your staff have the resources, the education to look at what is some of the new technologies that are available to extend the life. So it's not, again, it's an art and a science, because even an asset, it depends on its usage. We have a lot of assets in our communities right now that are not being used. That doesn't mean they're not deteriorating, because they are. They're just deteriorating a little slower. So it is definitely a complex formula, but a good philosophical conversation to have with your staff to demonstrate what investing in proactive maintenance versus reactive maintenance. So building that business case. So that was a very long answer to your question, but I just covered all sorts of stuff that I wanted to say. Is that helpful, or do you have anything further you want to add?
Well, I mean, what I'm thinking about is, say, for instance, you put in a pumping station, and its projected service life is 50 years. So to get that projected service life, they must have applied some maintenance factor to it, and that's what I'm kind of getting at is what's that factor? Where does that factor come from, and how real is it? Do we need to service the stuff more? Do we service it less? Do we plan to replace it earlier because we're not planning on servicing it as much? It might be more economical to do that than to over service it. So that I'm just kind of wondering who figures that out, and within staff, are there resources to actually project maintenance versus replacement costs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that is the role of your staff, is to provide options and consequences to those options to you. And then you get to decide what level of risk you're willing to assume. Because you're right, you can over service an asset, and that doesn't necessarily make sense to do that. If you follow the ISO standards, right, the international standards, you actually aren't going to be able to afford any of your services. So you get to decide that. This is a discussion that the board gets to decide in terms of what's the level of risk they're willing to assume. But what you don't want is for staff to be assuming the risk that the board should be assuming. So thank you for that question. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes. Just go ahead and mute and jump right in.
Thanks very much. My question, and again, asset management, I'm thinking in terms of, because I've been involved in the BC Fire Service for a number of years, replacement of fire apparatus, for example, a fire truck. We know that a fire truck, the service life for the most part is 20 years. And in some cases, you can get extensions for 4 or 5 years. Is it an opportunity here to have capital funds set aside on a continuing basis to replace that piece of apparatus instead of waiting until the end of 20 years to attempt to buy a new unit, for example?
Yeah. So you should actually have a vehicle replacement policy that ensures, because you don't want spikes in your budgeting process, right? You want to start, my dad, I grew up in a family of engineers, and he was actually the guy who, when he saved up money and bought his first car, the second he bought his first car, he'd already taken into consideration operations, maintenance, and started saving for replacement costs. So he would look after it so it'd last 10 years, and he could buy a new one when it began to fail. And so it's the same principle applied to you should have a vehicle equipment replacement policy that actually allows you to replace that equipment, and it takes the decision making away from it happening at a board level, and it happens just because you have a policy in place that makes sense. It shouldn't actually be something, because you shouldn't be debating amongst one another the merits of replacing one over another. It should actually be steeped in policy so that it doesn't lead to those spikes in changes in your budget. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. Yes.
So the question I had, my First Nation is really looking to get into asset management in a significant way. And one of the ways that I'm hoping to convince the nation that this is something that we need to do is to take advantage of the grant opportunities that exist within the provincial and federal frameworks. In a First Nation, this is our bread and butter in a lot of places when it comes to assets. And part of the change in mindset that we required was that it was always better to know the state of where we're in, even if it reflects poorly in some way, shape, or form on the community, because the way that the province and the federal policies work is that they fill need and they triage what's going on. So while we may find ourselves in Montreal adjacent situations, the true fact is that we need to know what those situations are in order to get out of them and get help. And so I'm not certain if that's always at the forefront of those decisions, but in the First Nations experience, that's something that has been very convincing in the individual conversations I've had with our members of council. I don't know that that's much of a question. I guess it's more of a comment, but yeah.
Thank you. And I fully agree with you. One of my observations in my work across the country is staff want to hide the truth from their elected officials because they don't want to overburden them. And one of the things I said at the beginning is that I would rather you do the right thing rather than the popular thing. And the right thing is being brave and telling the truth. Here's where we're at. Here are the opportunities. Here's the challenge we're facing. But here's the opportunities that we have to move towards a more sustainable, resilient future. And so by telling the truth and having that data and empirical evidence, you actually have the opportunity then to deal with the problem at hand. If you don't know what the problem is, if you don't know where you're at, you're not doing yourself any favors. So I would don't encourage your staff to hide the truth from you. Not that they are, but it's important that you know so that you know what you're dealing with. And I fully agree. And that's a philosophical conversation that elected officials, again, need to have early into their term around how they're going to manage difficult, uncomfortable conversations about what they should be doing.
I think that's definitely something that needs to be done so that expectations can be managed both on the administrative side, the political side, like the board side, but also with citizens, people who are looking at what's going on, because asset management and the spending of money to do these things often elicits very emotional responses from citizens. And the best way that I can liken this to is something that if someone is deeply in debt and has to make changes to their lifestyle to start a college fund or save for retirement, the first thing that they tell those people, and the first thing that personal finance experts say, is don't judge yourself. Like, avoid those negative thoughts, because you're going to have to check your bank account every day. And I know you don't want to, but you have to.
Yeah.
And it's the equivalent politically, that even though we're inevitably going to run into people, if the scenario is bad, it might not be bad in all instances, but if the scenario is bad, we will inevitably run into people who are going, well, you should have made that decision 8 years ago. Why should I have to pay for it? And the real answer is, if you do, that problem's only going to get worse. And so those political considerations often color that approach, and the worry ends up being the blame game and all of that sort of thing. But the blame game can be saved for silly season, and I know that we're a year and a bit away from that, but like, going from what you said, if you have that conversation early in the term of office, you can achieve a lot of things with a fresh mandate. I know that's shoulda, woulda, coulda in some instances, but I think even the gathering of that information and having a rational approach to it is exactly what you said, a philosophical thing. Thank you, though.
I had a conversation with my father-in-law recently, and he was complaining about, we were talking about taxes, and he was like, well, I don't want to have to pay for the future. I already paid for the past. And I said, actually, you've been receiving services and you haven't actually paid for them. So it's, you know, there's a concept called temporal fiscal equivalence. You get what you pay for, you get what you pay for when you get it. And I would liken our sort of current political climate across the country as that we've gone to a restaurant, we ordered a big dinner, and then when the bill came, we're like, well, I don't want to pay that, and we walk out of the restaurant, and we fail to connect the services to the level of service. And I totally agree. It's not about blaming or shaming or nobody did anything. There's no evil intent going on. So we need to stop that practice and actually just tell the truth and say, and here's where we're going to move towards. We're not going to fix it overnight. It is a relay marathon. We're not going to fix it overnight, but here's what we're doing to move towards being a more sustainable, resilient community so that we don't have to be embarrassed in the future. And now that we know better, we're going to do better. And that needs to be the message. And that requires courageous, brave, bold leadership. So, you know, bring it on, right?
And Ron had his hand up.
Yes.
Thanks for everything, Christina. And you may be going to cover this later in your presentation, but once again, I think you covered a little bit of what I am curious about. Asset management and asset replacement is extremely expensive. And as elected officials, once a year, we go through many meetings, budget meetings, talks. And certainly the message that comes loud and clear, especially when you talk about money, that's where the divorce happens with your public. And I'm just kind of curious about a PR program in simple terms for the public to get them to understand the need and the urgency for asset management without causing that divorce. And there's not one of us that's on this panel right now that doesn't have somebody come to us and say, hey, wait a minute. There should be a 0% tax increase. I don't care what it is. And people don't understand, even the cost of living increase ticks people off. So I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on how we sell the asset management, how we sell kind of the cost, and it is expensive. Replacing a bridge is expensive. Paving a road is expensive. And a lot of people don't understand the stuff that's buried. Water lines, sewer lines, communication lines, those sorts of things. So if you're covering this later on, feel free, but I'm sure every one of us in the back of our mind is thinking, well, God, budget time's only another 8 or 9 months away. How do we sell this? And in simple terms, so people can understand what we're up against.
Yeah, you know what? That's one of my favorite questions, because it was one of the things that, you know, was really important to me when I was mayor, was really connecting the services to the cost to provide services and using as many creative ways as possible to do that. And part of what I did was just compare, you know, how much do you spend on insurance, like car, house, and life insurance? Or how much do you spend on telecommunications? And then talking about, okay, here's all the services that you get for what you pay for. And we've inherited all these services and we've been benefiting from them. And we haven't, you know, historically and collectively done a good job of being prepared for the replacement. So one of the things I like about community engagement is just no one thing works, but everything works when you work it. And here's the thing. Use as many analogies that relate to people as possible. Use metaphors, tell stories. You know, my house is 20 years old, and it seemed as if all of a sudden the fridge, the stove, the roof, everything went at once, right? It's not unlike that. And guess what? I didn't go, oh, I should have a life cycle replacement plan for my fridge and a life cycle replacement plan for my roof. I didn't do that. And so we're all guilty of short-term thinking, and that's okay. But you can use as many metaphors to tell the story. What I think that's really important is that you are an advocate for the services, and that you ask people, that you say things like, do you know what it takes to provide a service? Like, do you know what it takes to run a local government? Most people don't. And you have to remember too, you're dealing with people that are fearful. They're scared. So there's no rational way to enter into the conversation. Recognize that they're fearful and try to get underneath that fear and try not to be overly reactive to it, because it's often the critical minority that will they feel like they're a big voice. It's because they're anxious and upset and fearful. And I get that. So, sit down, listen to people, and then ask really good questions to try to get underneath that. So
I think that's a very good point. And I'm sorry, my dogs may freak out right now, but the use of analogy and talking about that to our citizens that we represent in regards to a problem that we can fix, but also have to show that this awareness of the situations that people who have jobs, people who have businesses, their business models are, I don't know how long it may have taken them to set them up, and any changes to that model often presents a huge threat to even just their life sustainability. And that sensitivity is something that I think I fail at sometimes, because I'm looking at the issue on the governance side. We have a problem to solve. This is what we need to do. And I think that's the main thing that I need to work on as a governor, in that showing that, yeah, I am aware that you are concerned about just your entire life coming apart if you jump across that line of money. And I think that intersection of being truthful about those things and understanding and planning ahead is one of the core things in asset management, because if we do that, we can communicate what to expect as time goes by. And that, yes, it will go up, but it will only go up by this level. Before I keep going, I do have Diane Bodner next, but I'd like to check in with you first. Are we at the end of your presentation? And if so, can we stop sharing your screen? And then second, I'd like to ask Terry to give an update at some point as to just where we're at with asset management so far, because I forgot to do that at the beginning of the presentation. Yeah, please let us know where we're at.
Yeah, so I do realize that I am getting out of time. So I'm happy to stop sharing and also send you my slides so that you can take a look at them. Because to be quite honest, I would rather have this conversation than, because I think this is important, and this is the stuff that I care about, is actually having the conversation. So I'll send you my notes and you can read them over. And just so you know, I'm happy to answer questions anytime. So Diane.
And then once once you're finished with Diane, Christina, if Terry could just kind of give a quick overview of where we're at, then that might elicit some more conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. This is more of a statement than a question, but I thought it was important to share it with you. Especially when you struck a chord when you said, fix it and service it, that's important. But sometimes what happens in our communities, I know definitely in mine, is that people are complaining about the disrespect they have for their quality of life, because there is public access in different areas. And when we approach the Ministry of Transportation, they say, well, it's public access and there really isn't much we can do about that. And there's reasons around it. So I'm just saying, when there are things that people are concerned about, and the environment is taking an effect with erosion of the land with ATVs, and the fishing streams are being disturbed, it just makes it a little bit more difficult when that is not necessarily something we have control over in all those cases. So I just thought I would pass that along. Thank you.
Thank you. And the reality is that particularly when it comes to asset management and your role as an elected official, spend 85% of your time in the area where you have control, and then 13% in your area of influence. And that last 2% you can spend stewing, right, on your area of concern. But focus their tendency is to focus outside of our area of control, but focus, you won't go wrong if you focus the areas that you can control. So, and that's a challenge. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. It was helpful. Thank you.
Terry.
Yeah, please, Terry, go ahead.
That's great. Yeah, great discussion. So in terms of our asset management, we as a regional district decided to do our plans in terms of services. So I think we're going to end up with 13 plans altogether. We've completed 11. So that's the actual plan part, but integrating asset management practices is the part that we're really trying to focus on. And that includes, like, these plans have not considered natural assets. So we've put in an application to get some grant funding to kind of explore that portion of it. We're also looking from a staff perspective of how we can get to that next step. So the development of more maintenance plans. And when Director McNabb was talking about that earlier, one of the things that came to mind was in Beaver Creek, we have valves in the water system. I don't speak water very well, but I'll just give this a try. So we have valves in the water system, and basically they needed to be replaced because they weren't being exercised. And so now we have a maintenance program where all the valves every other year are basically opened and closed and checked, and it's extending the life of those. So the replacement, how many we're having to replace each year, is going down because we're using them more often, plus they're being more effective when we need them. So trying to look at those maintenance sort of ideas and figure out how to do that. The other major focus, especially of the finance department, is how we get from these being plans to being really solid decision-making tools to help us especially in that financial planning process. So A, how do we communicate it to the public, but B, how does staff present it to you as the directors in a format that is helpful in making these decisions? So I would say we're still early in our asset management days, but have made really big leaps in the last couple of years, and are looking forward to getting that next piece going. And that's all.
So that kind of reminds me of a question I'd like to ask, just in general, in terms of your experience with this. But when I think of asset management planning from a budgetary perspective, moving ahead into the future, it makes me think of the kind of contingency funds that we set up in operational experiences, at least in my nation. And it's usually a percentage of the entire take, so to speak. And the issue I have is, should we set up a reserve fund to kind of deal with unexpected developments in that sort of thing? And if so, I think that's a communication aspect as well, because it's money that's not being spent, right? And it's money that could stay in the pockets of taxpayers if you're looking at it from that perspective. So how can we communicate the value in having that covered off? And to what degree is a reserve account different than like an insurance premium or some other approach? Like I get the strategic value, but how do we play it from a tactical perspective of unexpected costs?
I think, you're bang on. You should definitely be building reserves in all of your services, and that's demonstrating fiscal responsibility and political responsibility to your residents. And I think the way you articulated that is exactly the way you need to articulate it. We're being responsible, and so we're ensuring that we're not kicking the can further down the road, so that future generations are going to have because. So we're dealing now with the fact that the infrastructure investment from 50, 70, 100 years ago, that in a completely different legislative environment, that it's all ratty and that it's in poor condition, and we don't have enough funds. So we haven't really been paying for the service. So part of the intention is to now to build the building reserves funds that actually protect the service and ensure the long-term sustainability. So again, reminding people to bring that seventh generational lens into their thinking and articulating it, and that's why you're actually building reserves in each service, so that you are prepared to at least at some level deal with the assets that provide the service. And I think the interesting thing about a regional district budget, this is what I loved about doing sitting at the CSRD, was I actually liked the budget processes because it was a little bit clearer, and you're doing service-based budgeting, and so you can really look at what do we need to do in terms of ensuring that we've taken the full life cycle cost into consideration. So that we're prepared to repair the roof and replace the fridge and the stove, right? Like, it's the same principles. And so using those analogies to communicate that we're actually doing this it's responsible governance, really.
Yeah, I guess my tactical consideration was that if you split them up into each different fund or each different line item, then you're restricting the amount of return on investment you could make if you placed the money in a lump with a fund manager of some sort. I mean, Hawaiian has invested wealth fund and those kind of reserves, and it's a double-digit recovery rate now, and we've been averaging between 5% and 6% over the past 10 years, and that's so much farther ahead than whatever FDIPI is, or the consumer price index and that sort of thing, like any measurement of inflation. And is that just something that's just locked in? We can't really get around that? Because I know with certain capital projects, you can do that in a short-term aspect, but I guess this is kind of a Terry question as well. Like, are there ways to take advantage of those kind of recoveries and have money in that position making money so that we're getting ahead of that, so that the reserve doesn't have to draw as much the further ahead in time you get? But that does take away from the alliance and confederation aspect of the regional district. And I guess I don't know where that lies, because First Nations are more like a municipality in that aspect, I guess.
Yeah, so if I can just answer that. So it would have to be budgeted in each separate service. So we would have to set up a contingency for each service legally, but we also could pool that money together if we were going to invest it in something. And then you just have, from an accounting perspective, just have to share the interest across those services that it existed on. So the answer kind of is yes and no. It definitely needs to be requisitioned from the service and the taxpayers that it's going to benefit. But in terms of what we do with it as we hold it, we have options to kind of pool it together.
Okay, so that's like our miners' trusts, where we have to have trust fund amounts for every miner that we receive money for, but it's all pooled in the back. So on the back end, you can do that, but you have to keep that accounted straight. Okay.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you. That's probably a huge waste of time for everybody else who knows that, but okay.
There's another question, John McNabb. And again, I'm not sure who's staff and who's director. So Director McNabb?
Yeah.
So what I'm interested in is the actuary part of this. I mean, a building typically has a service life of 75 years, but in year about 22, you know, the staff is going to be looking at redesigning the interior because they've got 3 more people they've got to put in, or it needs a games room or some other thing like that. Is there the actuary portion of that? Is there some consideration to that? And are there actuary kind of charts that can be applied to different assets, like whether they're vehicle assets like fire trucks or underground service assets? It does, in that back closet there that you've got behind there, is there Benty's bounty of actuary charts, or what?
So just so you know, I'm a former politician, so there are no actuary charts behind my door. I told you, I think like a scientist, but I talk like a preacher. So that's actually a really good question, and it's a good, again, that's a good question for the staff, where you should be engaging with the staff. And here's the art and science of that kind of decision making, right? And making sure that that's taken into consideration. That your life cycle costing is going to be your best guess. What's our best guess on full life cycle costing, and what and what you should be setting aside that's still best guess work. You're never gonna get it perfect. And this is one of the things with, particularly with people who are linear thinkers, they want, okay, I want to know exactly what those life cycle costs are. However, it's really knowing, okay, we're going to take our best guess and we're going to make sure that we're putting funds aside to take that into consideration. And what you're talking about is changes to level of service, and that is a decision of the board. So if you have a facility and you've determined its life cycle and you've determined what you're going to use it for, if you increase its usages, that's a deliberate change in service levels. And that's the service level language and conversation that the board gets to have at that level. And so I think what's important is that you are funding to the service level that you're delivering, that's how you think about your budgeting process and your life cycle costs. So I know that might be a little bit of a frustrating answer, but the pure numbers are going to come from your staff. But I'm glad you're asking the question, because that should be talked about here.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other comments, questions? I was worried I missed someone. Thanks. Please go ahead, Dr. Paulson.
Once again, this really circles around what we've just been talking about, but here in particular the Alberni Valley, I think we've been really guilty in previous years and up till now in not considering how we're going to pay in the future for something. And any thoughts on, we can't correct the wrong that we've done by not planning ahead yet, but we are the planners of today. We're in the position of what I call the bomb, in having to replace a major piece of infrastructure, an aquatic center here. And the decision, quite simple, is do we want to replace it, or are we going to do without it? And when you talk about taking a service away from your public, they'll go absolutely Versace. We have some money put away, and obviously borrowing is the way that you finance a lot of these major pieces of infrastructure, but it still comes out of taxation. So if it's financed over 20 years, each household is paying X number of dollars. So any kind of constructive help on, and I don't want to call it lack of planning, but just when we come up against that thing where you either got to replace an aquatic center or replace a roof on one of your major centers that you haven't put money away for, and it's going to cost you $200,000, and you're wondering, where are we getting that $200,000 from? And it's got to be done this year or in the next few months. So just some thoughts on the major pieces of infrastructure. The other one that's creeping up on us, and we think it's brand new, is the multiplex. The multiplex is 21 years old, believe it or not, gang. And it's for over 40% through its projected lifespan. So just thoughts on that major, what I call the H bomb. You either replace it or you do without it. And just some thoughts there.
Part of your very difficult job as an elected official is to determine what are the services we're going to provide to our residents and what are they willing and able to pay for. And so it's actually quite simple, but it's not easy, not to be confused with easy. It's having conversations with your community about, you can have anything you want if you're willing to pay for it, anything, right? But what you can't do is continue along the trajectory of just building shiny and new and not having a sustainable mindset, because otherwise you wouldn't be in this position. So don't do it to the future, right? and so it's articulating to the public, yes, you can have a pool and you can have this and that, and here's what it's going to cost you. And so this comes back to kind of the brave and bold truth telling that's without, and I fully agree with what Chair Jack said, and that is, let's stop the shaming and blaming. I know that decisions were not necessarily made well in the past, but people did the best they could. And in the interest of trying to keep taxes low, we've overbuilt our environment and now we're paying for it. And so what are we going to do about it moving forward? And I would say engaging the public on a regular basis, telling them the truth, give them the information, and expect them, like I said, expect not to come out unscathed. So Douglas.
Hello, very interesting conversation, and Director Paulson has come up with a very interesting comment about the multiplex. And right now we're about to embark on an Alberni Valley-wide conversation that must be preceded by a governance conversation about the aquatic center. That is to say, looking forward, who benefits and therefore who should pay for and bear what type of financial risk and who should govern this. So the board has already started and already invested some time in that conversation. That conversation really needs to get finished so that a proper conversation can have with the public. But if we could go back 30 years and have that conversation then instead and say, could we, looking forward, will our 30-year-old or 30-year-older selves benefit from a conversation about that now today? We'd have 30 years of replacement costs for the aquatic center. So then from there, I would say the multiplex is 21 years old, as Director Paulson has just highlighted for people. When the multiplex is 51 years old, 30 years from now, would we be happier if we sat down, maybe not immediately, but in the next couple of years, to talk about who benefits from the multiplex, therefore who should be contributing to the replacement of this building, if that's the service level that we collectively, the board rather, collectively thinks we should have. And so that conversation probably is the right, responsible conversation to be having as well. Maybe not immediately, but I think after the aquatic center conversation happens, I think we should learn from that work and apply that to the multiplex and maybe any other amenities that are broadly served. Because right now there's one entity bearing the financial and operational risks with a fixed contribution from the other area. So it's not that the city's paying for the pool and the multiplex all by themselves. They're not. But they do bear their risk because the partner shares right now are fixed. Now, maybe that's the model that everybody's happy with. That's not for me to say. That's a conversation that has to get finished yet. But we've certainly not been gentle with our elected officials with respect to our asset management plans. We've got some startling numbers in some of those. But the great news is the board's really good at having these tough conversations, and there are service level conversations that they're capable of having and absolutely will have, and making those decisions about what things do we keep doing or do we do them differently, and do we broaden our partnership opportunities in order to share things in common to lighten the load for if more hands are doing the work.
Awesome, thank you. So it sounds like we could clearly go on, and I want to respect your time. So I want to leave you just with really a couple of things, and that is keep it on the radar, keep it on your agenda. Make sure you keep having these conversations. They're so important, and I guarantee you that every decision needs to be made through the lens of sustainability and making those long-term sustainability. Your services and your service levels determine your budget and your long-term financial plan. So keeping the service level conversation at the forefront. Commit to having honest conversations with one another, with your staff, and with your community, and keep telling the truth. We have to get away from this magical thinking. We haven't paid for the past, and so we just have to tell each other the truth and stay the course. So you're not going to get out of this position anytime soon, but you're already on your way to good decision making. It sounds like we've got one more question here.
Yeah, I see.
Okay.
Director Cote, if you wanted to leave us off.
Thank you. I had a question for Terry. Just around at budget time, I'm wondering if staff or our contractor do any assumptions with our asset management. So are they doing any stress testing?
Like evaluating our risks, is that what you're meaning?
Basically, yes. So is that would figure into our budgeting at this time? Looking at what Viral does and how like we're 10 years into bringing our assets up to a standard and having reserves and everything, and it's taken a long time and great huge increases in the budget. So I'm just wondering if our budgeting process now is starting to look at that type of conceptual, identifying what the assets are and doing stress tests and saying if things break apart, this is what we're going to be paying, and trying to identify that. I just took an asset or a actuaries workshop, so there's a bunch of questions sort of coming from that aspect.
Sure. So I'll just talk about how we've historically budgeted. We've basically kind of, from a staff perspective, it wasn't our best approach, but it was basically like, what did we think was going to be the appetite of the board in terms of tax increases? And then basically what could we squeeze? How much could we squeeze into that? And so we were taking, I would say, and Douglas can chime in as well, but I would say we were taking a lot of that really tough decision-making out of the board's hands in a way. We were definitely presenting decisions, but weren't really looking long-term with the board. So this year was the first year that we've really kind of had these plans and have really tried with the managers to look beyond that 5-year and maybe even into that 10-year gap. It also was a year of a pandemic, and it was very clear from the board that those tax rate increases do still matter. And I don't think that will ever completely disappear, but we are going to have some tough conversations with our communities about these gaps, and that it is going to take financial resources to kind of close them. So I would say we're definitely moving in that direction. The other challenge that we found from a regional district standpoint is that some of our services are shared amongst the participants, and then some are individuals. So, for example, the fire departments are an area where we really have large infrastructure gaps, big assets, expensive assets, and we need to close those gaps, and there isn't really grant funding out there. But so in a lot of ways, I would say, okay, if we have an extra $50 a household, I want to throw it towards the fire department. But then you have these other services that are shared amongst multiple parties, such as the airport. So if I put money into the airport that's going to give an increase to Sprout Lake, then suddenly maybe there's not as much wiggle room for some more or additional reserve contributions in the fire department. So we really are hoping that early this fall that staff are going to be able to do a more comprehensive, overarching kind of long-term capital plan to present that. And that is partially why we now present it all at one time instead of presenting them in pieces, so that we can have that discussion. But I don't think we're quite there yet.
Mr. Chair, if I could just add a little bit, I think it's very important to have fact-based discussions, and our asset management plans are coming to where they're just about all done. We've got 2 out of 13 left to do. And so what I would say is, this is really the first year that we've been able to have a fact-based discussion. Prior to this, we've got a number of plans that were coming on the way. We did foreshadow a lot of bad news coming, but we didn't have the numbers like we do now. And so now it's really time to roll up our sleeves and say, based on the assumptions and based on these asset assessments at this time, here's where we're at now. And the best case scenario of these numbers is still a long reach from where we are from a sustainability point of view. So even once we make choices, and even once we, refine our understanding of the condition of our assets and their remaining useful service life and the value to replace them, even once we tighten those numbers up, whatever the scenario is, it's unfunded and by a fair ways. So I think So I think I think this is last year was the first year we actually were capable of having fact-based discussions, and again with the qualifiers around what the quality of the information is at this point in time, and with the qualifier that the board can pick service levels, and that's exactly what we're embarking on now.
Okay, that's appreciated. Are there any other comments or questions? Okay, seeing none. On behalf of the board, I'd like to thank you for your presentation, your materials, and the Q&A session we just had. So it's always great to see you, and hope to see you around more everywhere. Honestly, this is a situation that I think the entirety of Canada finds themselves in. So let's get to work, really. All right.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. Thank you for your time. And yeah, I'm going to be continuing the evangelistic message. So we'll talk soon, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any further discussion or further questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm cognizant of the time, so thank you for having that good conversation about asset management. That brings us into the correspondence and conversations surrounding the moratorium on recreational wolf hunting that was put forward by the District of Sauk. Just as a background, I do believe that we're having this discussion because we feel it's necessary to access points of information and arguments on either side of the issue in order to kind of arm directors with enough information to make a decision on how they'll vote at AVICC and at UBCM as time goes by. So before we start, I think what I'm going to do is ask Douglas if you could provide us an overview of where the staff is at in regards to what you think is appropriate, but also like what direction would you be seeking from us? Because that's my understanding, but I know that there's a use of staff time and resources in looking into something that isn't necessarily our jurisdiction, but is something that we may have an impact on. Right? So,
thank you, Mr. Chair. So this isn't, of course, part of our operations. This is not part of our strategic plan. It is, of course, always appropriate, however, for the board to use its power as an elected body to influence senior government's policy. And so that's how we characterize this, of course. We have taken some time. Wendy spent a fair bit of time trying to track down someone who can speak about this from a policy perspective from the provincial government, and has been unsuccessful. So beyond that, I think we would leave it to the board to debate to some degree if there's going to be letter writing, if the board is going to try to influence other entities outside of itself to, as I say, influence individual votes at AVACC or UBCM. And I think I would just leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
okay, thank you for that. So I do have to mention a couple of things that I've done myself in research and trying to find resources, but also Tom Steer appears to be, he doesn't call himself an expert, but he certainly speaks with enough verified information to be considered one. He couldn't make it today, but he does suggest that we do try to interact or get information from experts, one of which has been quoted to me several times because he's resident in the ACRD, Dr. Val Geist, I think his name is pronounced correctly. So this is something where I would love to have this person come in to talk to the entire regional district board. But I want to take a temperature gauge from individuals here, because we can also, if this is something where directors can just go towards this, I can try to set up some sort of informal, just Zoom call that we could call into and have a wider discussion outside of the auspices of the staff. But what I don't know is if that's kosher now that it's become an issue on the agenda. Is that something that we can do to save time and money, but does that sacrifice a level of transparency and accountability? That being said, it's not a jurisdiction of the Alberni-Clayoquot Regional District. Douglas, if I could get your thoughts first, and then I think
Sure.
I'd like to go to Director Shannon, because I know that she might have to go soon. So.
Sure, and I'd be grateful if Wendy chirps in on this if she has an opinion that is different than what I'm about to say. But I would view this, that if the board is going to take advice on a matter that they're contemplating, that is tantamount to advancing the business of the organization. And if that's happening and there's a quorum of elected officials, that constitutes a meeting, in my view, and would need to be advertised and properly constructed with with voting and all that good stuff. Wendy, is that, you have the same mind? Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I just felt like I was perhaps jumping the gun with this, but if this is something that board members are interested in, this could be created as a committee of the whole meeting at some point next week or the week after, but that's really cutting it close. So, Dr. Shannon, your thoughts?
Thank you. And thank you for letting me speak first, because I do have to get the kids fed and fingers crossed down for a nap before our board meeting this afternoon. I want to start by saying I really appreciate that we are taking the time to discuss this a little further outside of correspondence on a board agenda. I really appreciate it. I spoke to this quite a bit last time, so I'm going to keep this as short as I can. I am personally clearly opposed to this. And as much as I would like to see a letter, I understand that if it's just even more information to the board so everybody can make a little bit of a more informed decision, I'm happy that we've gotten that at the minimum. I'm really concerned with how this resolution is written, because it states that there's unrestricted harvest activities on the island. And that's just not true, because there is the provincial hunting and trapping regulations. The synopsis is every 2 years. So the current one is 2020 to 2022. And they can make changes and amendments to it within that 2-year time period. Right now, the current harvest on the island, if you have a valid hunting license, is if you're hunting, you can take 3 wolves. And they have to go to a compulsory inspection, and compulsory inspections happen. So you send data back to the province so they can use that as tools for wildlife management. Trapping, wolves are considered class 3. So that is basically only wolves and coyotes, I believe, in the province are, that the province has basically deemed that they can repopulate enough that they are not an animal of concern to them at that time, although that can change. So currently there's no limit on a class 3 animal for trapping. So I'm going to leave it at that, because that's one of my main concerns. Is I'm concerned that it's misleading when it says it's unrestricted, and that could influence people to vote a certain way, just because I don't think it's factual. And that's what I have a major problem with this. I am all for studies, like a wholesome, scientific, data-driven approach, as they mention. That's, like I said, I've talked about this before, but that's kind of my biggest issue right now. I don't know if we can write to say that we're concerned with the wording on it, or other people's thoughts. To Chair Jack, regarding having Dr. Geist speak to us, I would be happy to have that happen. He actually lives out here in the Beaufort, very knowledgeable, and I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts, but just wanted to reiterate the way this is written is where it makes me very uncomfortable. Thank you.
So I think I might call a few people for their comments. Oh, well, okay, some have already put their hands up. I have Dr. Roberts, then Dr. Cole. I wouldn't mind hearing from Dr. McNabb and Dr. Cote. Let's just get everyone. At this point, it seems like everyone has their hands up. So Dr. Roberts, please go ahead, and then we'll go to Dr. Cole.
Yeah, thanks through the chair to Director Shannon. Thank you for that. And I support your comments 100%. I think the letter that was sent was, it's like people going out to play tennis. It's recreational. Well, that's not the case. The other thing is that I've been an active hunter, fisher, and trapper actually in my lifetime. And I've had many encounters with wolves, and a couple of close calls, but nothing that I had to take any major action about. I know the farming communities and the ranching communities in the interior, and where I was doing some predator work with the government was up in around Merritt area, and that had to deal with issues of beef cattle calving and issues around them being taken by wild animals. So I think that Dr. Geist is willing to talk. He can deal with some of this misinformation that's going out there, and I believe that that's what the comments that we received have been misinformation. As far as sending a letter, I'm opposed to trying to get the government to do anything else. I think that the Fish and Wildlife Branch handles it quite clearly. And as Director Shannon mentioned, any hunting that is done for wolves is tracked very carefully and is considered by the government for future programs. So I appreciate it and thank you for that.
Great. Director Cole.
I just want to thank everybody for talking about this, because I will admit that when it came before our council, like I fear a few things do, without knowing the full big picture of things, sometimes a letter sounds like a good idea. And we're talking about hunting and catching things. I can't even catch my own dogs in my fenced yard. So I just appreciate that there's more of a conversation to it, even if it's in whatever way, shape, or form, the more information, because sometimes I do think letters end up going out where I am in agreement, but I might not know completely what I'm agreeing with to the detail that maybe I should. So thank you all.
Thanks. Okay, I have Director Beckett and then Director Bodner.
Thank you. I guess, I don't know if I can articulate this very well, but I think to start with, I really liked the approach that Director Shannon has taken. She's not trying to project or force us to make or have an opinion. She's just simply acknowledging that perhaps the letter wasn't accurate. So that's a really good starting point for me. I liken this issue to the COVID and getting advice from our provincial health officer, as opposed to getting it from Facebook or Twitter or some other source of information. So when it comes to an issue that we all can appreciate, can be a very passionate issue by some, associated with the the harvesting of wolves. I really do think that our role as regional government should be to point to the experts, and as Director Roberts said, leave it to the Fish and Wildlife to give us that guidance. And I guess that's where I'm coming from. I am not an expert in this. And if we go to some form of vote, I would probably abstain because I just don't have the data. And I think if we're going to bring an expert in, that expert should be someone from the province. That's my thoughts. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for your passion on this matter, Tanya. Thank you.
I have Director Bodner, and then I'd like to ask Director Cote's opinion.
Thank you. I'm just going to reiterate just what has already been said. I really strongly support that the Fish and Wildlife be strongly invited and advised and giving us advice. And I think that we start playing around with Mother Nature and starting killing things, boy, we better know what we're doing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Director Cote, your thoughts?
Thank you. This resolution comes from Oak Bay, and which is completely different area than Alberni Clayoquot. Oak Bay is quite residential, and they had a small wolf pack that I guess has just about been wiped out. So I can understand they're wanting to have a moratorium on recreational wolf hunting. It is recreational, and it's not what I would call protecting your property. I think that, be it animals or yourself, I think that's a different scenario. I do believe that our regional district is definitely taking the right approach. Thank you to Tanya for bringing this up, because a lot of resolutions just get looked over and people make fast, quick, you know, oh yeah, I don't want to see any more wolves die. But really, in real, you know, 3 animals, I'm not a hunter. I don't like hunting, but, you know, everybody has their right to do what they want if it's legally allowed. So definitely, I think we're on the right track. Thanks.
Thank you. Before I go to Dr. McNabb, I see that there's children behind you, Dr. Shannon, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for everybody's comments. I mean, obviously, I'm a hunter and fisher. I grew up doing this. So to me, that this tool of recreational hunting is just one part of wildlife management when we look at habitat, behaviors of the animals and everything. But I just want to say that I do agree that the province and their experts in the wildlife management should be the ones taking care of it. I just feel it's really important for us to talk about this. And like I said, bringing forward the regulations right now, because I feel like our hands being forced a little bit because we have to vote on this in a couple of weeks as elected officials at our level. And while I agree, I don't think that it should be us making the decisions. I feel like our hand, like I said, is being forced because this resolution has come to us. So I just wanted to state that, but I will probably be ducking out real quick here because
yeah,
things are, I'm losing control.
No,
but thank you again very much to everybody. I really appreciate the open dialogue that we can have on these things.
Okay. Thank you for that. Director McNabb?
So Director Shannon, control is probably an illusion. So anyhow, in Beaver Creek, we've had incidents of wolves going after farm animals, chickens and sheep and other small critters. You know, they've blamed it on packs of dogs. Well, it's not packs of dogs, it's packs of wolves. So, but nevertheless, you know, Fish and Wildlife are the experts on this. I'm certainly not the expert on this. And I have every confidence that their research and their ability to get statistics is way better than mine. And so I mean, I don't mind being informed on what the status of these little critters are, but the decision to stop hunting of them is not mine, and I don't really want it to be mine. I want it to be Fish and Wildlife because they're going to be there tomorrow to measure it. So that's my thinking. I don't know how we portray that in a letter, but you know, as far as I'm concerned, status quo is just fine with me. Thanks.
Right, and finally, Dr. Paulson, if you had any thoughts on the issue.
This is so far out of my wheelhouse that really the conversation is an educational piece for me today, and I really appreciate the conversation. But I really, at this point in my time in my life, really can't offer a well-educated opinion on the matter. I did watch a documentary, just for anybody who's interested. Was the reintroduction of the wolf pack into Yellowstone Park in the U.S. And it's a very interesting documentary, and it just shows how the reintroduction of a piece of wildlife that had disappeared from an area, and how nature kind of balanced itself out again in Yellowstone Park. And that's the extent of my knowledge. I really don't have much of a comment one way or the other, but I really appreciate the conversation and the dialogue, and it's made me, well, it's pretty tough to make me more intelligent, but it's informed me better.
Okay, please go ahead, Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Chair, so I'm wondering if there is a the cohesion that I think I'm hearing from the board isn't so much about pro-hunting or against hunting where wolves are concerned. I think it's the cohesion is around fact-based decision-making on those who have the authority and those who have the data. Mm-hmm. And if that's something that this committee is agreeing upon, then that's a letter that we could certainly craft with your direction.
Yeah.
And just wanted to procedurally just wanted to remind the directors for the Director Beckett's comment that if you're present at the meeting, you're either voting for or against. There's no abstaining. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So abstaining is a vote against. Yeah. So at that point, though, I think what we can do is send a letter pointing. It's kind of the Al Sebring maneuver at that point, is pointing out that this is not a consideration that should be put forward by a local government, but also to underline the regulations and the program steps that are in place under the provincial regime. And I think expressing faith in that, in the fact that they're going to know more about this going back generations, I think that's returning back to the foundation. And I think we can all agree that that's probably where, at the very least, where we want to go. And I think getting that letter out sooner than later is going to have a greater impact. So I didn't want to preempt you, though, Director McNabb. Is your thoughts? Oh, you're muted, though. Sorry.
I would move that motion as spoken.
Okay. Director Shannon, would you like to second it? Okay. Further comments? Great. Seeing none. All those in favor? All opposed? Okay. Motion carried. All right. Dr. Cote, you had a comment?
So I have a question. Where is that letter going?
That's
So,
it. I
Mr.
think
Chair, the letter that this committee is talking about went to a particular audience. What I
same audience.
What I was thinking is the same audience.
Okay. So all the CCs that the District of Sauk sent it to, we send it to the same thing. Does that work? Yeah. Okay. Because it's not the AVICC's problem. We're kind of acting on the outside. So thank you for bringing that up, though. I didn't even consider your part in that. So hopefully we didn't make you uncomfortable. Yeah.
Sorry, could we also include AVICC?
I think they were in on it too, but yeah, we should. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. I think that's pretty clear. So thank you for sticking around, Director Shannon. Okay.
Mr. Chair, once that's voted on, we would then be in touch with Director Shannon again to articulate some of the structure that is around it, which seems to be contrary to what is in the letter at issue.
Okay. So with that, then, if we're sending a letter to this basis, I think that maybe we can forego any more official conversations about this particular issue. And if there's anything informal that's coming, I'll just pursue that on my own private kind of sense. Dr. Roberts?
Yeah, through the chair to Mr. Holmes, I would like to be included in that conversation as well. I know you're going to be getting back to Director Shannon, but I'd like to be included in it as well. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We have one more item, I believe, and that has to do with provincial COVID grant applications.
Mr. Chair, I think we just have, I think it's got a mover and sector. I didn't,
No,
forgive me if it's already been voted on.
We did the vote. We did the vote already, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for waiting, Terry. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'm actually going to share my screen. Oops, not that screen. You guys don't want to see all my emails. Let me try that again. This screen.
There we go.
Okay. All right. So there is a report that we've included, and this is regarding the provincial COVID grant allocation. So we had talked about this earlier, I think near the end of March. We had some grant funding come in, and at the time we had requested that the board adopt the financial plan as is, and stated that would be coming back to this meeting discussing what we would like to do or how we would recommend the allocation of this funding. So we're just going to walk through our decision-making process, and really, I really wanted to make sure that I shared with you the criteria that are in these grants. The airport grant criteria and timeline is substantially different than the actual COVID restart funding grant allocation. But staff do not feel like we're at a point that we are ready to make a recommendation yet, but we did feel like it was valuable to kind of discuss with you some of the ideas that we've been bouncing back and forth numerous times, so that we can get a little bit of input at this point. So That's what I'll attempt to do today. So just so we're clear about what we're talking about, we have 3 different pots of COVID money that we've received, or additional pots. We have $180,000 for the Alberni Valley Regional Airport, $180,000 for the Long Beach Airport, and then an additional 166 to the amount that we got in the fall from the province that is called the COVID restart money. And that can be used however we would like to allocate it with the requirements of links to COVID. So we'll just go through each of them. Just kind of, this is how we started. This is probably a real life shot of my brain while we've thought about this, because there are numerous options for this. So we have 2 kind of options in our minds. We have add initiatives to the financial plan that we have not considered in the original plan, or offset some of the things that are already existing in the plan to create some surplus for next year that we could do something different with. So as we've been developing these are kind of the criteria of how we've been going through it. There's obviously the hard and fast criteria, grant criteria and timelines. The airport money has a fairly tight timeline. It must be spent by March 31st of 2022, whereas the other COVID restart funding, we must allocate by the end of December of this year, but there is actually no timeline on when we have to spend it. We also want to consider what our actual COVID impacts are, and those are still changing. Then we looked at what could we align with the strategic plan. Then do we actually have an ability to complete these initiatives, especially when we've talked about the airport ones? We have to make sure we meet that March 31st deadline. So are we able to do that? And then we'll talk about this a little bit more, but when the money was discussed in March, there was a motion passed by the board that said that we would like a bit of a rural area emphasis on how we allocate this funding. So we kind of today, that's one of the things we'd like to get as staff, is more of an indication of how important that is in our initiatives and when we're picking them. This is just a summary. I've condensed all of our strategic priorities into one slide. And most importantly, we kind of looked at that focus area 1, the economy and COVID-19 recovery, but some of these initiatives that I'll discuss actually address many of the other strategic priorities. So we'll just start with the Alberni Valley Regional Airport funding. So from a COVID impact perspective, there really hasn't been impact on this airport because, as you know, it's not something with scheduled flights. So our costs and revenues really have not been affected, with a small amount maybe of effect from the fuel sales, but even that is fairly minimal. There is many operational options that could fit the criteria. We could easily spend the full 180 on operational items that are already existing in the budget if we choose to do that. But we also feel like this is an exciting opportunity. We have this brand new AVRA visioning and strategic plan, and there's many different initiatives in that plan. But the committee and the board have not really had a chance to kind of create an implementation or an order of magnitude plan out of that. And so staff would like to take some time to go back to the committee to kind of determine what their priorities are and for us to kind of look at that. But again, one thing that is going to work a little bit against us in that is that March 31st, 2022 deadline. So as we present to the committee, that would be making sure that we're very clear on that for this portion of the funding. So that's kind of our thought process and how we're kind of still up in the air on this funding. In terms of the Long Beach Airport, there has been COVID impact to this airport in terms of the revenue. So there was in 2020, we did allocate some of our initial restart funding to this, but there continues to be revenue impacts in 2021. And we just think that it would be good to kind of see what those are before we allocate some of that money would be one option. Again, so many operational needs that fit the criteria of this grant that we really could just apply it to that. But we've also had a few items that would really kind of help us look at new revenue generating options that we need to complete some projects before we can do that. So one of those things is we have a draft land use plan but we need to do some consultation in advance of finalizing that plan. So could this money be used to maybe hire a consultant to just help us get that across the finish line? The other thing is that there is a lot of steps that are required to create subdivisions out there so that we can do some long-term leases. We are having significant interest in both airports, but especially out here for these long-term leases. But one of the items that we need to do, and before we can proceed with that, is a contaminated sites profile. And there's other development planning issues. So that's another option that staff is looking at, is should we be allocating or recommending that we allocate some of this funding to this type of work that is really challenging to fit into the financial plan each year. And then with the COVID restart funding, of course, when it can cover multiple services, our options actually grew and are kind of endless, really, except that it has to be related to COVID. So there was quite a few initiatives that we came up with as a management team that was like, okay, wait, but how do we link that back to COVID, and weren't able to. So I will walk through some of those, but a couple of the items we wanted to talk about was that we are still having COVID related expenses. As we are preparing to reopen to the public, there is a bit more infrastructure or plexiglass and different things that needs to be installed to get us there. So these costs we are in the process of pricing, but we haven't got them. So they're still unknown. And then, as I mentioned, I wouldn't mind a bit of a discussion about how much of a weighting towards the rural areas would the directors like to see. So I'll just give you some examples of the items that we are talking about. So one of the items that would fit would be the Maplehurst parking lot development. So this is an issue that has been brought up by the public and has been created by the additional use that has been seen during COVID. It aligns with our strategic priorities, but there are some challenging governance. I wouldn't say challenging. There are some governance issues that need to be addressed if we're going to do this. The park is right on the boundary between Cherry Creek and Beaver Creek, but also kind of to Beaufort. So there is a potential that the current trail network right now is in Cherry Creek. Very likely the parking lot's going to be located in Beaver Creek, and potentially the trails to get from that parking lot into the Cherry Creek trails would be through Beaufort. So right now that is a Cherry Creek community park. So how would we do that if it became cross-boundary? That is one of the items we need to discuss. A business continuity plan. I wouldn't directly say that this aligns with our strategic priorities, but probably could just be seen as fundamental business practices. But this would be organization-wide and not rural focused. The Parks and Trails Maintenance and Improvement Plan. So we haven't quite got the asset management plan done yet, but we have had some good discussion regarding our parks and trails, and getting a maintenance plan and kind of more clearly defining that level of service would be a great priority. And this would be aligned with our strategic priorities and would be partially rural focused. Obviously, there's a regional parks component too. Support for building inspection and development of a citywide application portal. So we've actually just at the last board meeting had a motion to apply for a grant for this. So we are seeing significant development and applications in the planning department and are needing some extra support. But if we get the grant that we've just applied for, then we don't want to allocate the money to this purpose. So this one was a little bit tricky. I think it maybe would be, from a staff perspective, one of our top priorities to some degree if we don't get that grant, but kind of are hoping that they're going to have a quick turnaround on that. That application's already been completed. We're hoping there's going to be a quick turnaround so we know if we get that funding. No direct link to strategic priorities, except for from an economic development perspective or development in general. It's booming and we're very busy. Grants to outside organizations. So we could actually provide this to grants that are to organizations that are providing services to vulnerable populations. And actually, it's unfortunate that Director Shannon had to leave. I don't think she's still here, but the other option would be the community halls. So some of these community halls, I know Beaver Creek Community Club has reached out to her and was looking for some grant opportunities because they're having troubles generating revenue to keep the lights on in this pandemic world. I haven't in particular heard that from Cherry Creek, but I'm assuming that they have the same issues, as well as from Sprout Lake. So those are the 3 community halls that we partner with already, but there would be other options. So maybe this is a grants to outside organizations. Staff has also kind of talked about maybe this is just an allocation per electoral area of a certain amount of money for the director, if it meets the criteria, that we can allocate to something in their area that's area specific. And the last kind of idea that we had is the communications position. So this got pushed to January 2022. Originally, staff had recommended for a September 2021 start date in order to start to move that priority along. It would have a partial rural benefit for 2 reasons. A, we deliver a lot of services to the rural areas, but the other part is our mapping, GIS and mapping technician, about 20% of her time is spent with like website updates and all of those type of things, as those fall into her job. Those duties would then be transferred to the communications position, which would actually free up more of her time to be doing like the mapping work and all the things that are required that mostly benefit the rural areas. So those are kind of a number of the ideas that we have been mulling over. And I'm just gonna see if I had, no, that was in. So yeah, at this point, we would just love to have some discussion. I will stop sharing my screen so that we can see, and I can reshare if you want to see something, but it'll just be easier if we can see everybody.
Thank you for that. Any comments or questions? Director McNabb, I think you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
So yeah, without the screen on there, the Maplehurst Park thing is something that I would like to see us proceed with. I mean, it does involve 3 of the regional districts, and I don't think that we should be pursuing the business restart portion of it. I don't think that there's a big enough impact based on the amount of dollars that we would have to spend. And I mean, we have to consider that we've got more rural areas than just the Alberni Valley, and those rural areas should be benefited by this funding. And so, I mean, the communications piece is likely something that would benefit all of the rural areas, likely would benefit the municipal areas as well, but it is something that's quite difficult in our rural areas to get good communication out there. So it might be an opportunity. So that's my thinking on it. We certainly want to be using this to the benefit of the rural areas as a whole, and you know, kind of trying to equalize what we did with the first round of budgeting. Thank you.
Director Cote, I saw your hand up in the participants. Yep, and then we'll go to Director Bodner after.
Thank you. So question to Terry. We distributed some of the monies to the fire departments for the super washing machines. I'm wondering if this would be a good opportunity to take another look, because fire departments, you know, they don't get grants coming along ever. So having the ability to actually get the fire halls some more funding here, was there any consideration to what we could do with the fire halls again? I know that I've suggested a gen set for one of the fire halls at Sprout Lake. Thanks.
Yeah, so if I may respond, the fire halls are challenging. Besides having this extra equipment change that we kind of linked to COVID, they really haven't had to change their business practices all that much besides some PPE. So we did talk with the chiefs, but trying to find a link to COVID, which is a requirement of this funding, is the challenging portion of that. And the gen set like that's just an operational thing. There's no link to COVID that we can create that would make that qualify. So that one has definitely been discussed, and we've looked at a couple different angles. But in terms of making that link to COVID, that's where we've struggled. And Chair Jack, can I just comment on, so we have talked a little bit about how some of these initiatives, like for example, Maplehurst Park, would definitely benefit the Alberni Valley more, and how we would then need to create some pockets of funding for those other outside areas such as Long Beach and Bamfield. But I think what we are looking for as staff at this point was kind of those key initiatives that would fill up kind of the bulk of it for Long Beach and Bamfield, because they both run emergency planning programs. I think that it would be very easy to allocate funding to support those programs, which would help them. So I definitely think that we've been thinking about that equalizing part. It was kind of like, what are the big rocks that we're going to put in first, and then we'll figure out what the rest of the small pieces are after that.
Okay, thanks. I do have Director Bodner next, and I think we do have to remember that the motion that we should move forward is just receiving the report as well.
Yes, just a quick response to Maplehurst Trail. I certainly support whatever we can do to develop that more, and also finding a way to communicate more with the rural districts. I think is very frustrating, and something that we need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Roberts?
Motion to receive.
Oh, thank you. Do we have a seconder? Thank you, Director McNabb. Any further comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? Okay, motion carried. Before we move on to question period, were there any comments that I missed? Okay, seeing none. Terry, oh, sorry, Dr. McNabb, please go ahead.
So my comment is, as staff got enough to work with this, I think this was put in front of us to give us an opportunity to make a decision of where we want to head with it. That's all.
No, I think it does give us some more direction. I think we also just wanted to give you an update that this isn't just here we're going to give you a report because we didn't have time to think about this. We are really actively trying to work on this. And I think for one thing, we just need a little bit more time in terms of as we're preparing to reopen. I think we're going to kind of flush out the rest of these COVID related costs. But yeah, a little bit of the direction on the no, maybe potentially to the business continuity, and really kind of lean towards those electoral area initiatives is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I'd just like to ask Wendy if there are any comments or questions at the responses email.
No, Mr. Chair, there are no questions or comments, and no participants today, public participants in the meeting.
Okay. So with that in mind, I'm hoping to get a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Director Beckett, seconded by Dr. Paulson. All those in favor? All opposed? Okay, motion carried. Thank you, everyone, for attending and going into the lunch period. I'll see you at 1:30. Oh, hi, Kristen.